What you're looking at here is a bit of bathroom graffiti. I have to confess that I like graffiti. I know it's not reasonable, but about late at night, I go to a website sometimes called Notes from the Stall. Their motto is that it's always lemony fresh. But when I was approached about this talk and asked to find a title, this bit of graffiti actually summed it up pretty well. I have a job, like many of you, that keeps me very busy. And so when I took up photography a few years ago, I had to find time to do this in places that were very close to home and in small moments that I could snatch away. And oftentimes these were very much in the morning. And I found myself, as I kept taking these photographs, that I was gravitating toward tiny, small things, tight focus on images, and especially the things that I could find off my deck. That was what was available to me. And I also realized that as I was doing this, taking photographs of the same thing more than once, that I was really following a pattern that I had begun having an interest in from childhood. When I was a child, we had a set of books with a copy of Walden included in that. In Walden, Thoreau talks about a battle of the ants that he watched for 2 days between the black ants and the red ants. And for the most part, he reports on this rather scientifically, dispassionately. But then he can't help but try to find meaning in what he's seeing. And he starts comparing this Lilliputian struggle to the Trojan Wars. And it's that focusing tightly and finding a way to move back away from that to understand what you see that I found is the reason that I take photographs and why I keep finding it interesting to do. A couple of years ago, I started taking photographs of a single plant out on our deck called the moonflower. This is a member of the deadly nightshade family. It's poisonous. It's sometimes found in love potions. But, and every part is poisonous. It causes hallucinations and death, but it's also very beautiful. The plant, to me, has a very interesting architecture. It opens up looking a bit like an okra pod, a long tube, translucent in the light, as you can see, and then gradually the flower moves up the stem to a little bit like an English umbrella and coiled tightly around that, and then gradually begins opening up into a spiral at the top. The plant keeps on pushing out, and finally in this picture you can see the next days because coming along in sequence there. Each blossom lasts only 1 day when it finally opens up. Finally, at the top, you can see a star shape holding on to the 5 points of it there with, again, the successes behind it. And the spiral finally keeps on opening. And in the early morning light, the architecture becomes clear and the translucent blossom simply starts to shine. I caught this one early in the morning. I look at it almost like a line of drunken sailors weaving back and forth on the way home. You might have your own metaphors for it. But that gorgeous bell with the translucent walls there. And then finally, I can catch it in the morning sometimes covered with dew. And I can still see that texture that gives it additional interest to me. Inside, the blossoms are simply loaded with pollen. And over the course of a summer, it became the locus of its own small ecology. Ants began to come to it. I don't know why this cricket came, but he stayed most all of the summer, going blossom to blossom. The bee came. If you look closely, you can see that he already has a full load of pollen tucked in the little saddlebags on his back legs there. But there was still time to make one more stop, add a few more, and then fly away again. And I felt lucky to get him there, caught between these two stems as he was leaving there. The bumblebee came also a little slower, a little bit more awkward. And then this guy arrived, moving blossom to blossom through the course of the summer, looking almost as green as the stem itself, and I suspect that gave him a bit of camouflage. And sometimes he had some luck. He had moved over to a spent blossom to enjoy his meal in leisure there. He moved back in again, of course, to set himself up for the next one to come along. By the end of the day, I thought of the blossoms as almost looking like an evening gown tossed across the bottom of a bed, waiting to be put back up in the morning, but gradually fading away until there was a kind of brown ghost of what had been there before. If we left them long enough at the base of the stem, there was this large burr that would form that contained the seeds for the next year's plant. Over the course of this time of taking these, I've learned that the patterns that I could watch on the one plant of life and death and growth and decay started to expand so that I began to see patterns in lots of places. In many cases, this was a kind of starburst pattern. You're looking, of course, at the Japanese honeysuckle, very invasive, but at the heart of that star shape is a gorgeous scent. The cactus has its own patterns of stars within stars and with vertical uprights as well. Earlier this summer, I began taking photographs of a variegated yucca plant, the same kind of starburst pattern that you see there, and gradually the blossoms move up the stalk and begin to open up into gorgeous things. This also became a small ecological system as well. Ants discovered it, set up a kind of cafeteria line. The yucca, I found, is a plant that is so rich in sap that if you touch it, you come away sticky. And the ants simply, it was almost really like a smorgasbord, is that the word? This animal showed up. At first I thought it was there for the ants, but I was wrong. The mouth parts aren't right. It was there actually for the sap also. This is something called a leptoglossus, a leaf-leg bug. Now, over the years, I've developed a kind of menagerie here. This small thing, the cicada shell, I love because it's almost like a small piece of sculpture. The animals have been back with us this summer. They bury underground, stay there as long as 17 years, climb up the nearest tree, split the shell open at the back, and out emerges this, a huge bumbling thing that sings loudly looking for a mate for about 2 weeks before it dies. Even there's beauty in the things that are sometimes unexpected or that threaten us a bit. Crickets came, the katydids came. Sometimes they were bright against the background, sometimes hidden. I'm not interested necessarily in simply documenting, but I'm always interested in the composition. In this photograph of the cricket, this is the only one of a series because the angle of the legs echo the angles of the stems that it's sitting on, and that composition seems somehow more satisfying to me. This small praying mantis is only about 1 inch long, but its body reflects and can help the leaf above it, and then it helps to kind of create a kind of pattern of interleaving movement back and forth across the screen. Sometimes it's as simple as finding two shadows that point your eye toward the droplet of water there. Sometimes the pattern is so complex that it's very difficult even to find a point of focus in there until you get in very tightly, so that the legs and the forearms help you to find those gorgeous, gorgeous red eyes. Up to now, I've been talking about these things in very, very small ways and tight focuses, but the same pattern of observation can be expanded a bit. For the last 25 years or so, I've been making a trip to Augusta, Georgia once a month. And to make the trip a little faster and more interesting, we take the back roads. And this is an area of farms and orchards, of small towns and of old houses. They haven't changed much outwardly, at least in a long time. And as I go down along the little river in Newberry County, is this meadow. There's something satisfying to me visually about the way the large sycamore tree on the right is balanced by that line of trees on the left. For several years now, every time I drive by, I stop and take photographs, and I can watch the seasons change and come and go from January and February and March. And some years the hay is more ready than other years. Sometimes the drought causes it to be ready in June rather than in August. But what I've learned from this is not just to watch the seasons, but I've learned that as I see these things, I can find connections. That in these small ways, the moonflower is connected to the spider, and the mantis is somehow connected over to me, and I'm connected to the absent landlord that I've never met in all of these years of driving by his farm. I don't want to say that I know that plot of land as well as he does, but I feel a sense of ownership about it, and I'm very jealous about that. 2 years ago or so, they cut down some of the evergreens there to put up a deer blind. I felt a little violated by that. But I have to recognize it's hunting territory and it's his farm. The ownership I have of it is only through the camera. And I borrow that life for just a little bit at a time, just as I borrow the life that I see out in my backyard. My bathroom philosopher said focus equals life, and that's not such a bad thing. I feel like that when I can focus this way, I know that I'm at least more alive than if I were not doing that. And that I live more both in the moment and in my own mind. When I was in college, a fortune teller told me that if I were not careful, I'd be a preacher. So I've been really careful ever since. But if I have a sermon, it's this: that if we focus, we find these connections, and everything connects to everything else, and everything depends on everything else, and every one of us depends on everyone else. And we just need to focus and try to remember that. Thank you.